The letter was already sealed when Theresa Wallace realized what she had done. She stood in the middle of the post office in Caldwell, Kansas, the year 1878, her fingers pressed flat against the wooden counter as if trying to stop the earth from spinning beneath her feet. The postmaster, old Mr. Gibbs, had already taken the envelope from her hand and was reaching for his stamp when she nearly lunged across the counter to snatch it back. Nearly. But she did not, because snatching it back would have meant explaining herself, and explaining herself would have meant confessing the secret she had been carrying like a stone in her chest for 3 months. She had written to a man named Frank Langston on behalf of her best friend, Clara Hensley. She had written to him with Clara's words, Clara's hopes, Clara's carefully described dreams of a life on the frontier with a good and steady man. She had written to him as a favor, because Clara had broken her wrist falling from the back porch in February and could not hold a pen without pain. She had written the first letter, and then the second, and then, somewhere between the third and the fourth, something had shifted inside her chest like tectonic plates grinding together in the dark. She had fallen in love with every single word he sent back, not just the words, but the mind behind them. The honesty, the way Frank Langston wrote about the Kansas prairie as if it were a living creature he had pledged himself to protect. The way he described his failures without shame and his hopes without arrogance. The way he had written, in the letter she received just 2 days ago, that whoever she truly was, and he had said whoever she truly was, as if some part of him already sensed the hidden motive she had buried beneath Clara's name. He believed a person's soul could be known through the words they chose. And now Clara was getting better. Clara's wrist was healing, and Clara wanted to start writing to Frank Langston herself. Theresa walked out of the post office into the white January light of 1878 and stood on the boardwalk of Caldwell's Main Street with the sound of horses and wagons and the distant clang of the blacksmith filling the cold air around her. And she understood with terrible clarity that she had built something beautiful on a foundation of deception, and that the whole magnificent structure was about to come crashing down. She had written to him as a favor for her friend, and she had fallen in love with every word he sent back. And now she was going to have to find a way to live inside that wreckage, or find a way to confess the truth before Clara's own handwriting arrived in Frank Langston's mailbox and destroyed everything, including 2 friendships that mattered more to her than almost anything in the world. The wind off the prairie cut through her wool coat like a blade. She turned her collar up and started walking home. It had all started in October of 1877, on a Thursday afternoon that smelled like wood smoke and dried grass. Clara Hensley had come running across the field that separated their 2 properties. The Hensley farm and the Wallace farm shared a fence line out near the edge of town, with a newspaper folded under her arm and her cheeks flushed red from the cold and from excitement, which in Clara's case were often indistinguishable from each other. "Theresa," Clara had called out before she even reached the gate, "I need your help with something important, something that could change my whole life." Theresa had been at the well, hauling up water for the evening washing, and she had set the bucket down and waited because Clara had a habit of building to things dramatically, and it was usually worth the wait. Clara had unfolded the newspaper on the fence post between them. It was a copy of the Caldwell commercial, and she had circled an advertisement in the back pages with a lead pencil, circled it so many times the paper was starting to thin at the edges. Theresa had leaned in to read it. The advertisement said, in plain and careful language, that one Frank Langston, age 31, rancher of Comanche County, Kansas, was seeking correspondence with a woman of good character and honest spirit, with a view toward companionship, and if God and fate were willing, matrimony. He listed his address as a ranch 12 miles south of Medicine Lodge, which was roughly 60 miles southwest of Caldwell. He described himself as a man who worked hard and believed in the written word as the most honest form of introduction. He wrote that he was not looking for prettiness or performance, but for someone real. Theresa had read it twice. Something in the phrasing caught at her in a way she had not expected. Someone real, not the prettiest advertisement she had ever read, but the most genuine. "He sounds wonderful," Clara had said, practically vibrating. "Don't you think he sounds wonderful?" "He sounds honest," Theresa had said, which was what she meant. "I want to write to him, but Theresa, you know how I write. My letters always come out sounding foolish. You have the gift, you always have. You write so beautifully." Clara had grabbed Theresa's hand across the fence post. "Would you write the first one for me? Just the first one to get things started. I'll tell you everything to say. You just put it into your words." Theresa had hesitated. It had felt slightly dishonest even then. But Clara was her dearest friend in the world, 26 years old and still unmarried in a county where that was beginning to attract the kind of pity that made people uncomfortable. And Theresa had thought, it is just a letter. Clara will take over when her confidence builds. It is just one letter. "All right," she had said. "One letter." She had written it that same evening at her father's writing desk, by lamplight, with Clara sitting across from her dictating what she wanted to say. Clara's ideas were sweet and genuine, but when they came out in Theresa's hand, they became something more layered, more searching. She had written about Clara's love of the land and her belief in plain dealing and her curiosity about the wide open spaces of Comanche County. She had written questions, real questions, about what it meant to build something from nothing on the frontier. She had signed it, as agreed, with Clara's name. The answer had come back in 3 weeks, which was fast for the Kansas postal system in 1877. Theresa had brought it to Clara immediately, unopened, and they had read it together sitting at Clara's kitchen table with cups of coffee going cold between their hands. Frank Langston wrote the way a man thinks when he is not trying to impress anyone. He wrote about the ranch, about the particular quality of silence that settled over the prairie at dusk, about the way the grass moved in the wind like something breathing. He answered every question Theresa had put in the letter with precision and without pretense. And then, at the end, he wrote something that made Theresa set down her coffee cup very carefully. He wrote, "I am not a man given to flowery speech, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there is something in the way you ask your questions that makes me think you might be the kind of person who asks them because she genuinely wants to know the answers, and not because she is performing curiosity for an audience. That is rare. I would very much like to hear from you again." Clara had sighed happily and said he seemed lovely, and did Theresa think she could write the reply, because her wrist was really quite painful today. Theresa had said yes. She had gone home and she had sat at the writing desk and she had started the reply, and somewhere in the middle of the second paragraph, she had stopped pretending she was only Clara's instrument and had started writing as if the conversation were her own. Not maliciously. Not with a plan or a hidden motive she could have named in the moment. Just honestly. Because Frank Langston's letter had asked for honesty, and honesty was what came out of her pen. By November there had been 4 letters exchanged. By December, 7. Clara had read each one Theresa brought over and declared them wonderful, but Clara's attention had begun to drift. There was a hardware merchant in town named Edgar Pratt who had started coming around, bringing her small gifts and lingering near her fence. And twice in December Clara had said something like, "I trust you completely, Theresa. Just write whatever feels right." And Theresa had felt the deception deepen like a hole widening in the ground beneath her feet. In Frank's 6th letter, he had written about his dark past. Not obliquely, or with the careful vagueness most men used when referencing things they were not proud of, but directly. He wrote that he had spent 2 years, from 1869 to 1871, working as a hired hand for a cattle operation that he later learned was involved in practices he considered unjust toward the Osage people whose land lay nearby, and that when he understood what was happening, he had walked away from the job and the wages he was owed and had started over, and that this decision had cost him a great deal, but he did not regret it. He wrote that he believed a man's character was measured by what he was willing to lose in order to remain himself. Theresa had read that paragraph 4 times in a row. She had felt something give way inside her chest, something that had been held carefully in place for years, and she had recognized it as the particular pain of discovering that the thing you had been searching for, without knowing you were searching for it, had just appeared in front of you under impossible circumstances. She had written back with her own truth in return, disguised as Clara's truth, but her truth nonetheless. That she believed people were most themselves in the moments when they had the least to gain from performance, and that she had spent most of her 25 years surrounded by people who performed themselves rather than lived themselves, and that she found it exhausting. Frank had written back and said he understood exactly what she meant, and that he had spent years feeling like a foreigner in rooms where everyone else seemed to know the steps to a dance he had never been taught. That was when Theresa Wallace had understood she was in serious trouble. Now it was January 1878, and Clara's wrist was healed, and the last letter Theresa had sent, the letter she had just dropped at the post office, sealed and irrevocable, had been written entirely from her own heart and soul with almost nothing of Clara's actual thoughts in it, and she had no idea what she was going to do. She walked home through the cold Kansas afternoon and sat at her father's writing desk and put her face in her hands and tried to think clearly. Her father, William Wallace, was a widower who ran a modest dry goods store on Main Street. He was a quiet man who read a great deal and spoke carefully, and had raised Theresa alone since her mother died of fever when Theresa was 11. He had given her books and time and the freedom to think her own thoughts, which she understood was not common for a woman in 1878, and she loved him for it deeply. He came home at 6 o'clock and found her still at the desk, the lamp now lit against the winter dark, staring at nothing. "You look like a woman who has done something she cannot undo," he said, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "I may have," she said. He sat down across from her and waited. Her father had always understood that waiting was the kindest thing you could offer someone who needed to find their own way to the words. She told him everything. About Clara, about Frank, about the letters, about the way she had slid, almost without noticing, from being Clara's voice to being her own self in those letters, and about the way Frank's words had taken root in her and grown into something she had not planned for and could not now uproot. Her father was quiet for a long time after she finished. The fire crackled in the small stove. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows. "You have built a relationship on a foundation of hidden identity," he said finally. "That is a serious matter, I know. Does Clara know how far this has gone, emotionally, I mean, for you? No. And does Mr. Langston know he has been writing to someone other than the woman who signed the letters? No." Another silence. "Then you have two confessions to make," her father said. "One to your friend and one to a man you have never met. Both of them are going to be painful. The only question is whether you make them now, while there is still a chance of preserving something, or whether you let Clara write to him herself and watch the whole thing unravel without your hand on it at all." Theresa looked at her father. "What would you do?" He thought about it seriously, the way he always did. "I would be honest," he said. "Not because honesty is always safe, but because the alternative is a kind of slow suffocation. And your Mr. Langston already told you in his own words that he values people who tell the truth even when it costs them something." She went to see Clara the next morning. Clara was in her kitchen, her healed wrist moving freely as she kneaded bread dough, and she looked healthy and happy and slightly distracted in the way she had been since Edgar Pratt had entered the picture. Theresa sat at the kitchen table and watched her friend for a moment before she spoke. "Clara," she said, "I need to tell you something difficult." Clara looked up, reading something in Theresa's tone that made her still her hands in the dough. Theresa told her, slowly, carefully, not sparing herself. She said that the letters had started as Clara's and had become hers, not through any deliberate plan or calculated betrayal, but through the particular kind of drifting that happens when something true starts speaking through you and you lack the courage to stop it. She said she was sorry. She said she understood if Clara was angry. She said she wanted to be honest now even though she should have been honest sooner. Clara was very quiet through all of it. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She looked out the window at the winter field for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Are you in love with him, Theresa?" "Yes," Theresa said, because her father had told her honesty even when it costs, and it cost. Clara was quiet again for a long time. "Do you know something funny?" Clara said finally, and her voice was soft and complicated. "I have been feeling terribly guilty for the past 2 months because I realized I was not really thinking about Frank Langston at all anymore. I was thinking about Edgar. Every time you brought me one of those letters, I read it and thought, yes, good, and then went right back to thinking about Edgar." She paused. "So I have been deceiving him too in a different way, letting him think the letters were sincere from my side while my heart was entirely somewhere else." Theresa stared at her friend. "I should have said something sooner," Clara continued. "I kept thinking I would develop proper feelings for Frank if I just waited because he sounded so good on paper. But I think the feelings I had for those letters were actually feelings for the writer, and the writer was you." The kitchen was very still. Outside, a crow called from the bare elm tree. "I am not angry," Clara said. "I am relieved, and I am sorry that I put you in that position in the first place. If I had written to him myself from the beginning, none of this would have happened." She reached across the table and took Theresa's hand. "But perhaps this is exactly how it was supposed to happen. You should write to him as yourself, Theresa. Tell him the truth and let him decide." Theresa gripped her friend's hand and felt the tightness in her chest loosen by some small but significant measure. "Edgar," she said, "is it serious?" Clara smiled, and it was the smile of someone who has finally admitted something out loud that they have known privately for a long time. "He asked me last week whether I would consider walking out with him formally. I said I would think about it." "You should say yes." "I know," Clara said. "I am going to." Theresa walked home through the cold with something that felt almost like permission, though she knew permission was not the word for it. The real word was honesty, finally operating without disguise, and the feeling it produced was both terrifying and clean. She sat at the writing desk that evening and she wrote the hardest letter of her life. She addressed it to Frank Langston, Comanche County, Kansas, in her own handwriting, which he had never seen. She wrote her own name at the top, Theresa Wallace, and she took a breath and she began. She explained everything. She started at the beginning, Clara's broken wrist, the newspaper advertisement, the favor among friends, and she worked her way through the months with as much precision and honesty as she could manage. She did not minimize her own role or excuse herself with convenient explanations. She said she had begun writing as Clara's voice and had gradually, without full awareness of what she was doing, replaced Clara's voice with her own, and she said this was a form of deception even if it had not begun as one, and she was sorry for it. Then she told him what had happened to her. She told him how his words had reached her. Not in flowery language, because flowery language was not what the situation called for, but in plain and direct terms that she thought he would appreciate better than poetry. She wrote, "I am not asking you to forgive me or to feel anything toward me that you do not genuinely feel. I am writing to you now as myself, finally, because I believe you deserve to know who has actually been on the other end of these letters. If you are angry, I understand. If you want no further correspondence, I understand that too. But I could not let Clara begin writing to you in her own hand without first telling you the truth about who has been writing in hers." She paused. Then she wrote one more thing. She wrote, "Your letter in December, the one about the Osage, the one about what you were willing to lose in order to remain yourself, I have read it more times than I can count. I think it is the most honest thing any person has ever written to me. I thought you should know that it mattered very much, even if it was not addressed to me by name." She signed it Theresa Wallace, 24 years old, dry goods man's daughter, Caldwell, Kansas, and sealed it before she could lose her nerve. She mailed it the next morning. Then she waited. Waiting in 1878 was not the impatient finger-tapping kind of waiting that would come later when the world sped up its communications. It was a deep, physical waiting that settled into the body and had to be lived through day by day. The postal service between Caldwell and Medicine Lodge was not unreliable, but it was not fast either, and the midwinter roads were often made difficult by weather. She estimated she would not have a reply for at least 3 weeks, possibly 4. She threw herself into work. She helped her father at the dry goods store, counting inventory and serving customers, and keeping the books in the careful longhand her father had taught her. She visited Clara, who was blooming with happiness over Edgar Pratt and who had the grace not to mention Frank Langston, unless Theresa brought him up first. She read every book in the house twice. She walked the frozen fields around the property in the late afternoons until the cold drove her back inside. She thought about Frank Langston constantly. She turned his letters over in her mind the way she might turn a stone over in her hand, examining the underside, looking for what she might have missed. She thought about the darkness and the secrets implied in things he had written carefully around without stating directly. The 2 years of work he had walked away from, the unnamed people he had hurt without meaning to, the specific quality of loneliness that she had sensed beneath his careful and honest language like a current running under still water. She thought about the fact that she had never seen his face and did not know the sound of his voice, and that she was in love with him anyway, in love with the version of him that existed in language. And she wondered whether the real man would match the man on the page, or whether she had constructed something in her imagination that the actual Frank Langston could never live up to. She also thought about something else, something that bothered her in a practical and specific way. If Frank was angry, and he had every right to be angry, he might write a reply that was cold and final, ending the correspondence and leaving her with nothing but the memory of something that had never quite been real. Or he might not write back at all, which would be a different kind of answer but an answer nonetheless. She had to be prepared for both. She was not entirely prepared for what actually arrived. It came on a Thursday, 4 weeks and 2 days after she had mailed her confession. She was behind the counter at her father's store when Mr. Gibbs came in from the post office across the street with an envelope in his hand, and an expression on his face that said he was perfectly aware he was carrying something important. The envelope was addressed to Miss Theresa Wallace in a handwriting she had never seen before, square, deliberate letters, the kind produced by a hand more accustomed to rope and wood than to pen and paper, but precise in a way that spoke of someone who believed precision was worth the effort. She waited until Mr. Gibbs had left and her father had tactfully found something to do in the back storeroom. Then she opened it. The letter was 3 pages long, which was the longest Frank had ever written. He began without preamble. He wrote, "I am not going to pretend I was not surprised, because I was. I sat with this information for a full week before I felt I could write back without letting the surprise color everything I said in ways that were not fair to either of us." She exhaled slowly and kept reading. He wrote, "I want to tell you something that I think you deserve to know right away." Reading back through the letters now, knowing what I know, I can see the places where the voice shifted, where it became something more searching and more willing to sit with uncomfortable questions. I noticed it at the time without knowing what it meant. I thought whoever I was writing to was growing more comfortable with me and letting more of herself show through. I did not think there was a different self involved entirely. But now, I think perhaps the version of you that emerged in those letters was the most genuine version, and not only because it was genuinely you, but because it was you letting yourself be known without the armored distance that most people maintain when they are first writing to a stranger. She put the letter down for a moment and pressed her hand flat against the wooden counter because her hands were shaking. She picked it up again. He wrote, "I am not angry. I want to be clear about that. There is something in this situation that might have made a lesser version of me angry, some wounded pride perhaps, some feeling of having been made a fool. But I have thought about it honestly, and I cannot find the place where I was deceived into believing something false. The things you wrote to me were true, even if they were written under someone else's name. The questions were your questions. The honesty was your honesty. What I fell in love with was real. It was just wearing a borrowed coat. She had to stop again. Her throat had closed. He had written, "What I fell in love with." He had said it plainly, without performance, the way he said everything. She read the rest of the letter carefully, absorbing every word. He said he would like to continue the correspondence, now under honest terms, and that he would very much like to know more about Theresa Wallace, who was 24 years old and a dry goods man's daughter from Caldwell, and who asked questions because she genuinely wanted to know the answers. He said he understood if she wanted to take time before responding, but that he hoped she would not take too much time because the winter in Comanche County was long and quiet, and he had developed a habit of looking forward to letters that he was not ready to give up. At the very end, in the last paragraph, he wrote something that she read 4 times in a row, the way she had read his December letter about the Osage. He wrote, "I do not know what you look like, and I do not know the sound of your voice, and I am finding, to my considerable surprise, that it does not matter to me in the way I might have expected. I know the inside of your mind and something about the structure of your heart, and those things seem to me considerably more important than anything a face or a voice might tell me. I hope you will write back. Theresa Wallace. I have been calling you Clara for 3 months in my head. It is going to be a relief to finally have the right name." She wrote back that same evening. Not the next day, not after she had waited a careful week the way some sense of protocol might have suggested that same evening, because Frank Langston had told her in his very first letter that he valued people who answered honestly and without calculation, and so she answered honestly and without calculation. She wrote as herself completely, fully, with nothing borrowed and nothing performed. She told him about her childhood, about her mother who had died when she was young, about her father who had given her books and the freedom to think. She told him about Caldwell, about what it was to grow up in a cow town that was simultaneously rough and civilized, where cattle drives ended and money changed hands and fortunes rose and fell in the space of a single season. She told him about her friendship with Clara and about the way she had felt when she first read his advertisement in the newspaper, not a longing to write to him herself, not exactly, but something closer to recognition, like hearing a word in another language that happens to sound exactly like what it means. She told him something that had been sitting in her chest for weeks. She wrote, "I have been afraid to want this." Not specifically this, meaning you, meaning these letters, but any of it. Wanting something you cannot clearly see yet, wanting someone you have never touched or spoken to or shared physical space with, seems like a kind of madness to me in the daylight. But in the evenings, at this desk, by this lamp, with your letters in front of me, it seems like the most reasonable thing in the world. She asked him questions too, real questions, the kind she had been asking since the beginning, but now without any pretense of asking on behalf of someone else. She asked him what the ranch looked like in January. She asked him what had driven him to put that advertisement in the newspaper, what specific loneliness or specific hope. She asked him what he was afraid of. She sealed the letter and mailed it in the morning and felt, for the first time since October, like herself. The correspondence that followed was different from what had come before, and not only because both parties now knew who they were talking to. It was different because it was free. The letters that had passed between them in Clara's name had been true but slightly compressed, slightly careful in the way that all things are when they must fit inside a borrowed shape. Now the letters could expand into their natural dimensions, and they did. Frank answered her questions with the same direct precision he had always used, but there was something warmer in it now, something that allowed itself to be warmer without apology. He described the ranch in January, the particular way the snow lay flat and white across the grassland, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts, and the occasional dark shape of cattle moving slowly in the cold. He described the small house he had built himself over 3 years, starting with the walls and adding the roof last, and how there was a window on the south side that he had placed specifically to catch the afternoon light, because he had noticed that he was a better person when there was light. He answered the question about the advertisement. He wrote, "I am a man of 31 who has been alone for most of his adult life. Not because I lacked the opportunity for company, but because I was, for a long time, not ready for it. I had things to work out about myself that I needed to work out alone. By last September, I felt as though I had worked most of them out, or at least made reasonable peace with the ones I could not resolve entirely, and I thought perhaps it was time to try. The advertisement felt honest in a way that other approaches to finding companionship did not. I did not want to court someone through performance. I wanted to find out if conversation was possible first." He answered the question about what he was afraid of. He wrote, "I am afraid of building something with a person and discovering too late that the foundation we built it on was not solid. Not because either of us was dishonest, but because the early version of two people who are just getting to know each other is always slightly different from the later version, and I have seen enough of the later version surprise people badly. I suppose what I am really afraid of is the moment when the real thing shows up, and it is not what was expected." She read that particular paragraph twice and then wrote back immediately, the same day his letter arrived, with a response she had not planned but that seemed necessary. She wrote, "What you have described, discovering too late that the foundation was not solid, I understand. But I want to point out something that I think is relevant. We began in deception, you and I, not a chosen deception but a stumbled into one, and when the truth came forward anyway, we both responded to it. We did not retreat from it. Perhaps that is not a perfect foundation, but perhaps it is a more tested one than most. Most couples begin in their best selves. We began in a kind of unplanned honesty, and it held. I find that encouraging." Frank's reply to that letter came back in less than 3 weeks. He said, "You have made an argument that I cannot find a flaw in. This is, I am coming to understand, somewhat characteristic of you." She laughed out loud in the empty store, startling a customer who was examining bolts of calico near the window. By April 1878, they had exchanged 22 letters. Theresa kept every one of them in a box under her bed, tied with a piece of string her father had brought from the store. She knew the letters almost by heart. She knew the shape of Frank's handwriting, the particular way he formed his capital letters, the slight drag in his lowercase g that suggested he had learned to write from a left-handed teacher who had been forced to use his right hand. She knew the way he approached a difficult subject, a slight formality in the first sentence, as if testing the ground before putting his full weight on it, and then a gradual loosening as he found his footing. She had also, very tentatively, started to know the shape of his life in the practical, physical sense. She knew the names of his horses, an old brown quarter horse named General, and a younger bay mare he called Patience because she had none. She knew that he employed 2 ranch hands during the busy seasons, brothers named Moses and Henry Dupree, who had come west after the war and who were, Frank said with quiet plainness, the best workers he had ever had the privilege of working alongside. She knew that his nearest neighbor was a homesteader woman named Mrs. Aldrich, who was 73 years old and occasionally sent him jars of pickled vegetables that he ate out of politeness, though he could not say he enjoyed them. She told him about her own daily life with equal specificity. She described the dry goods store, the particular smell of it, canvas and soap, and the faint mineral smell of the metal goods, and the rhythm of the days there. She described the boarding house at the end of Main Street where the drovers stayed during cattle season, and the way the town changed character entirely between April and October when the drives were coming through, becoming louder and faster and slightly dangerous in a way she had grown up alongside and knew how to navigate without being frightened by it. She described herself, carefully and without flattery. medium height, brown hair, brown eyes, a face that she thought was generally unremarkable though her father called it expressive. She told him she had a habit of forgetting to eat when she was reading, and a tendency to argue with books out loud, which had alarmed more than one customer at the store. She told him she could ride a horse adequately but not well, and that she was a better cook than her father but not by a margin she found entirely comfortable. He wrote back that she sounded exactly like the person he had been talking to for 6 months, and that this was the greatest possible compliment he could pay. In May, Frank wrote a letter that was different from the others. Not in tone, the tone was the same, direct and warm and without performance, but in what it proposed. He wrote, "I have been thinking about something for a while, and I am going to say it plainly because I believe that is what we both prefer. I would like to meet you, not as a formal proposal of anything and not with any specific expectations. Just, I would like to put a voice and a face and a physical presence to this person I have come to know through paper and ink. I would like to sit across a table from you and have a conversation that does not take 3 weeks to travel between us. If this is too soon or too forward, I understand, and I will not raise it again until you feel ready. But I wanted you to know that the idea is there, on my end, and that it is serious." She read the letter sitting on the front step of her house in the warm May afternoon, with the smell of the prairie grass coming in on the breeze, and she held it in her lap for a long time after she had finished reading it. Too soon or too forward were not the words she would have used. What she felt was not reluctance. What she felt was a specific kind of fear that she recognized as the fear of the moment when the real thing showed up. The very fear Frank himself had described in his earlier letter. She had his mind and she had his words and she had the version of him that existed on the page, and she was about to discover whether the actual man matched what she had come to love, and she was terrified by that in the way you can only be terrified by something that matters enormously. She wrote back. She said yes. They arranged it carefully. Frank would ride up to Caldwell on a Saturday in June, the 16th. They agreed, and they would meet at the hotel dining room on Main Street, which was a public enough space to be appropriate and a comfortable enough one for a first real meeting. She would be wearing a blue dress. He said he would be the man who looked like he had ridden 60 miles on a Friday and slept at the livery stable because he had ridden 60 miles on a Friday and slept at the livery stable, which made her laugh again at her desk and which she decided was a very good sign. The week before the 16th was the longest week of Theresa Wallace's life. She told Clara, who responded with an enthusiasm that was somewhat exhausting in its energy and entirely genuine in its warmth. Clara was now officially walking out with Edgar Pratt, who had turned out to be a quiet, steady sort of man with an honest face and a gift for small practical kindnesses, and her happiness was the uncomplicated kind that made it easy to be happy for her. Clara insisted on helping Theresa alter her best blue dress to improve the fit at the waist and shoulders, and spent an afternoon at Theresa's kitchen table doing so while they talked about men and expectations and the specific terror of wanting something real. "What if he is nothing like the letters?" Theresa asked. "What if he is exactly like the letters?" Clara replied, snipping a thread with the small silver scissors she kept on a chain around her neck for that purpose. She thought about that. The 16th of June arrived with a blue sky and a dry heat that was already, at 8 in the morning, promising to become one of those Kansas summer days that press down on everything like a flat hand. Theresa dressed carefully, her hair in a neat knot at the back of her neck, her blue dress fitting better than it ever had thanks to Clara's precise needle. She sat in the hotel dining room at 11:30, which was when they had agreed to meet, with a cup of coffee in front of her that she was not drinking and her hands folded on the table to keep them still. She heard the dining room door open. She looked up. Frank Langston was 31 years old, medium tall, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of physical work in an outdoor climate. He had dark eyes, not the fashionable kind of handsome. His face was too angular, too sun-worn for that, but a face that had the quality of being deeply itself, unmistakably itself. The kind of face that you would know anywhere because it matched the person behind it so precisely. He was scanning the room. His eyes found her. He stopped. She saw something pass across his face. Recognition was part of it, and relief was part of it, and something else that she did not have a word for yet but thought she might develop one for eventually. He walked across the dining room and stopped at her table. "Theresa Wallace," he said. His voice was lower than she had imagined, steadier. It had the quality of his letters, careful, direct, not performing anything. "Frank Langston," she said. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other for a moment. Then Frank said, quietly and without any of the awkwardness she had been afraid of, "You are exactly what I expected. I mean that as the highest possible compliment." She felt the breath go out of her in a long, slow release of tension she had been holding for 9 months. "So are you," she said. They talked for 3 hours in that dining room. The coffee was replaced twice, and a meal came and went, and neither of them paid it very much attention. They talked the way they had always talked, which is to say honestly and without performance, but now with the added dimension of expression and voice and physical presence, and the added dimension only made everything richer and more certain. He told her things he had not written. Not secrets exactly, but the texture of things that language on paper only approximated. The way he talked about the ranch had a quality of love in it that was different from what she had read, deeper, more complicated. The love of a man who had built something with his own hands and understood both what it had cost him and what it had given him. The way he talked about Moses and Henry Dupree had an easy warmth in it, a respect that was genuine and specific rather than general. She told him things she had not written, too. The particular shape of her loneliness, not dramatic, not bitter, but the quiet kind that comes from being the sort of person who thinks in 3 directions at once in a community where thinking in one direction is already considered sufficient. The way she had felt reading his first letter, that sense of recognition, like hearing a word that sounded like what it meant. Toward the end of the afternoon, Frank said something that stilled the conversation in the way a particularly important sentence does, making everything around it go a little quieter. He said, "I want to be honest with you about something. I have not let myself say the word love out loud yet, even to myself, because I was not sure it was fair to feel it before we had met in person. But sitting here with you, I am finding it is a word that keeps coming up. I do not want to frighten you with it, but I also think that not saying true things because they might be inconvenient is a habit I am trying to break." Theresa looked at him across the table in the warm June afternoon light. "I am not frightened," she said. "I have been feeling the same thing for some time." He looked at her very directly. "How long?" "December," she said. "Your letter about the Osage." Something moved across his face again, that thing she did not have a name for yet. "That is the one I almost did not send," he said. "It felt too personal, too much like handing someone a map to everything weak in you." "Yes," she said. "That is why it worked." Frank Langston stayed in Caldwell for 2 days. On the second day he met her father, who served him coffee and spoke to him for an hour with the careful precision he used for everything important. And afterward, when Frank had gone to check on his horse, her father said simply, "He is what he appears to be. That is rarer than it should be." "I know," Theresa said. "Do you want to pursue this?" "More than I have wanted anything," she said, and her voice came out steady, which surprised her pleasantly. "Then I hope you will," her father said. Before Frank left, standing on the street in front of the hotel in the early morning with his horse saddled and ready, he said, "I want to keep writing, and I want to come back if you will allow it. Not as a performance of courtship, but as I am just going to say what it is. As a man who is serious about building something real." "Yes," Theresa said. The word came out simply and without hesitation, which was how she knew it was right. He rode south toward Comanche County in the June morning, and she stood on the boardwalk and watched until he was gone from view, and then she went home and wrote him a letter immediately, the same day, because she was Theresa Wallace and she did not wait when she knew what she wanted to say. The summer of 1878 passed in a rhythm of letters and visits. Frank came to Caldwell 3 times, once in July and once in late August and once in September, each time staying 2 or 3 days, each time leaving her more certain and less afraid. She visited the ranch once in August, making the trip south with her father as chaperone in a rented wagon, and she saw for the first time the flat immensity of the Comanche County landscape, and the small, carefully built house with the south-facing window, and the barn that smelled of horses and cut hay, and the particular dry sweetness of summer grass. She had stood in the south-facing window of the house in the afternoon light and looked out at the land, and something had settled in her, something that had been restless for years, as if the land itself were answering a question she had been asking without knowing she was asking it. Frank had watched her from across the room without speaking, and she had turned around and found his expression and understood, from the way he looked at her standing in that light in that window, that there was no question remaining for either of them about what they were building and why. In September, during Frank's third visit to Caldwell, he asked her to marry him. He did not ask in a decorated or theatrical way. He asked the way he did everything, directly and without pretense. They were sitting on the front step of her father's house in the evening, the first cool edge of autumn in the air, the sky going deep blue and then purple in the west, and he said, "Theresa, will you marry me? I would like to do this properly, and I want to ask you plainly so there is no possible misunderstanding. I love you. I want to build this life with you. Will you come to Comanche County and be my wife?" She looked at him in the fading light of the Kansas evening. She thought about October, about a newspaper advertisement she had read on a fence post in the cold, about the first letter she had written under someone else's name, about the slow and unplanned process by which she had fallen in love through ink and paper with a man she had never met. She thought about his voice, which was lower than she had imagined, and his face, which was exactly what it appeared to be, and his mind, which she had known for months before she knew his name, and which was, she had concluded, the finest mind she had encountered in 24 years of reading books and talking to people. "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the step between them, and they sat together in the cooling evening and did not need to say anything else. The wedding was held in Caldwell in November 1878, at the Methodist Church on 2nd Street, a small ceremony attended by her father and Clara and Edgar Pratt and Moses and Henry Dupree, who had come up from the ranch in their best clothes, and a handful of neighbors and friends. Clara stood beside Theresa as her witness, her face bright and emotional in the way it always was when she felt something deeply, and Edgar Pratt stood beside her looking steady and content in the way that suited him perfectly. Reverend Tull, who had known Theresa since she was 11 years old and who had watched her grow up in the pews of his church, read the ceremony in his measured and deliberate voice, and when he reached the part where Frank was asked whether he took this woman to be his wife, Frank said yes with the same directness and certainty he brought to everything, looking straight at her as he said it, not at the Reverend, not at the room, at her. She said yes in return and meant it completely, with all the complex, layered, tested weight of everything that had brought them to this moment, the borrowed name, and the confession, and the fear, and the real conversations that had grown out of the honest wreckage of all of it. They rode south toward Comanche County 2 days later in Frank's wagon, her belongings packed in 2 trunks in the back. Her father stood at the edge of town and watched them go. She looked back once and saw him standing straight in his good coat with one hand raised, and she raised hers in return, and then the road turned south, and the town of Caldwell disappeared behind the curve of the land. The prairie stretched ahead of them in every direction under a sky that was enormous and pale and cold. She sat beside Frank on the wagon seat with his shoulder against hers, their breath making small clouds in the November air, the horses moving at a steady walk on the road south, and she felt something she had been working toward for a very long time without knowing the destination. She felt completely at home. The first winter at the ranch was not easy. This was a practical fact that no amount of love or preparation made otherwise. The house was small and the work was constant, and the cold was a specific, relentless kind of cold that came in off the prairie without obstacle and made everything building fires, hauling water, feeding animals, take twice the effort of warmer months. Theresa, who had grown up in town, had to learn things that took time to learn, and she made mistakes, some of them frustrating and some of them genuinely costly, and she had to decide what kind of person she was going to be about that. She decided she was going to be the kind of person who learned, without letting the learning humiliate her. She asked Moses and Henry Dupree questions openly and accepted their answers without embarrassment, which she could see surprised them initially. They had been expecting the kind of pride that turns practical ignorance into a problem, and their respect for her seemed to grow as the weeks passed. Henry, who was the older of the two brothers by 4 years, and who had a quiet humor in him that reminded her a little of her father, started leaving small practical notes for her on the kitchen table sometimes, written in his careful hand. Things like best time to check the water trough in the cold is mid-morning, when the sun has been on it a bit. She kept every one of them the way she kept every written thing that mattered. Frank was the kind of husband she had believed he would be based on the letters, and found to be true in practice, attentive without hovering, honest about difficulty without being pessimistic, capable of apology when he was wrong and capable of accepting it from her when she was. They argued twice in that first winter, real arguments with raised voices and closed doors. Once about a financial decision Frank had made without consulting her that she considered her right to be part of, and once about something smaller that she could not fully reconstruct afterward but that had felt important at the time. Both arguments resolved with honest conversation and no residue of resentment, which she considered a very good sign about the structure of what they were building. The letters had prepared them, she thought. 7 months of learning each other through the most precise and unguarded version of language available had given them a foundation in honesty that they could return to even when the daily friction of shared life made everything feel complicated. In February, on an evening when the snow outside was deep and the stove was burning well and Frank was reading at the table across from her while she wrote a letter to her father, she looked up from the page and looked at him, this man she had come to know through ink and paper and had found to be real, and she felt something so complete and uncomplicated in that moment that she had to take a breath to contain it. He looked up and caught her looking. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Only that I am very glad." He held her gaze for a moment with that expression she had eventually found a name for. It was the expression of a man who is exactly where he means to be. "So am I," he said, and went back to his reading. Spring came, and with it the first cattle drive of the season and the long days of work that went with it, and the return of Moses and Henry full-time, and the rhythm of the working ranch in full operation, which was noisy and physical and demanding, and which Theresa found she loved in a way she had not fully predicted. There was a satisfaction in the tangible, in the concrete reality of animals fed and fences mended and crops put in, that balanced something in her that books and conversation, as much as she needed both, could not provide on their own. Clara and Edgar Pratt were married in April in Caldwell. Theresa and Frank rode up for the wedding, and she stood beside Clara the same way Clara had stood beside her, and she thought about how the deception that had seemed like a catastrophe in January 1878 had ultimately been the thing that sent two women in the right directions. Clara toward Edgar, who was exactly right for her steadiness and practicality, and Theresa toward Frank, who was exactly right for her precision and her hunger for genuine things. She said as much to Clara during the wedding dance when they found themselves together near the edge of the room for a moment. Clara laughed and said, "I have thought the same thing. Isn't that strange? That the thing that felt like a betrayal resolved into something better than what we had planned." "Not a betrayal," Theresa said. "Just a detour." "A very productive detour," Clara agreed. In the summer of 1879, Theresa realized she was expecting a child. She told Frank on an August evening, sitting on the step of their house in the last light, the way they often sat in the evenings when the work was done and the day was cooling toward night. She said it plainly because plainness was their language. "I am going to have a baby," she said. Frank was still for a moment. Then he turned to look at her, and she saw something on his face that she had never quite seen before, not the steady certainty she was accustomed to, but something more open than that, something that reminded her of the expression people wear when they receive the thing they have been hoping for so long they had started to suspect they would not receive it. "When?" he said. "February, I think." He took her hand. He did not say anything immediately, and she knew he was finding the right words, which was something she had always admired about him, that he took the time to find them rather than filling the space with whatever words were immediately available. "I am glad," he said finally. "More than I know how to say correctly right now, but I am very glad." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the August evening, on the step of the house he had built with the window on the south side to catch the light, and the prairie stretched out ahead of them vast and familiar and full of what they were making together, and she was glad too. The pregnancy was mostly straightforward, which she recognized as a mercy in 1879 when the alternative could be quickly grave. Mrs. Aldrich, the 73-year-old neighbor who sent the pickled vegetables, turned out to have extensive practical knowledge of childbirth and prenatal care, accumulated over a long life in frontier conditions, and she came by regularly with advice that was sometimes alarming in its directness and always useful. Theresa wrote long letters to her father describing the progress of the pregnancy, and her father wrote back with the measured warmth that was his particular gift. And twice, he made the journey south to visit, each time staying a week and talking to Frank in the evenings about books and cattle and the particular questions of the territory. She also found, during the pregnancy, a new relationship with the land around her. She had loved it from the beginning, but in a slightly external way, the love of a newcomer who sees the beauty without fully belonging to it yet. During those months, something shifted. She began to feel as though the land knew she was there, or at least that she knew it, the particular wildflowers of the Comanche County spring, the way the grass changed color through the summer, the specific sounds of the prairie at night that she had been afraid of at first and had come to love. She felt as though she was being woven in, slowly and without ceremony, the way everything permanent happens. In February 1880, on a Sunday morning when the winter light was thin and pale, and the snow outside was still and undisturbed, she had their son. Frank named him William, after her father, and she cried when he suggested it in a way that surprised her with its completeness, not grief, but something too large to contain quietly. Frank held the baby and looked at her with William in his arms and said softly, "He has your eyes, I think." "He has your ears," she said, wiping her face with the back of her hand, "which I consider a fair trade." William Langston grew through that first year in the way babies grow on working ranches, which is to say surrounded by the noise and smell and physical reality of a full and purposeful life. He was a curious child from the beginning, attentive in a way that seemed to belong to a considerably older person, watching everything with the serious concentration of someone taking notes. Moses Dupree, who had a daughter of his own now in the small house he and his brother had built on the south end of the property, was particularly delighted by William and spent long autumn evenings carving him small wooden animals that accumulated on the shelf above his crib. Henry Dupree, for his part, had developed a habit of reading to William from whatever he happened to have at hand, mostly almanacs and the occasional newspaper, occasionally a worn Bible, in a low murmuring voice, and William seemed to find it as satisfying as poetry, which Theresa thought said something admirable about both of them. The letters never stopped entirely. The postal letter, she meant, the physical written kind. She and Frank were together now and did not need letters to close the distance, but she still wrote to her father, and to Clara, And occasionally Frank would come in from the barn and find her at the writing desk and ask what she was working on. And she would say she was writing a letter, and he would stand behind her for a moment reading over her shoulder. And sometimes he would say something like, "You could put that more clearly in the second paragraph," which she invariably accepted in the spirit of the editorial honesty she had always appreciated from him. Once, about 2 years into their marriage, she found him sitting at the desk himself, writing something in his careful square hand. She looked over his shoulder the way he looked over hers, and she saw that he was writing a letter to her father. She did not read it, but she stood behind him for a moment with her hands on his shoulders and felt something warm and complete move through her, something she thought might be the specific feeling of knowing you are in exactly the right life. In 1881, Clara and Edgar Pratt welcomed a daughter they named Rose, and the two families became closer than ever, visiting on holidays and occasionally on ordinary Saturdays when the distance and the work permitted. The children growing up knowing each other the way children know people who have always been there, without thinking about it. Clara came to stay for a week in the spring of 1882, while Edgar was away in Wichita on a buying trip, and she and Theresa sat up late 2 nights in a row at the kitchen table, the way they had sat up late at Clara's kitchen table years before, talking with the freedom that comes from friendship so long and tested it requires no navigation. On the second night, Clara said, "Do you remember when I ran across the field with that newspaper and asked you to write one letter as a favor?" "I remember very precisely," Theresa said. "It was the most consequential thing I have ever done," Clara said, "and I did not know it at all." "Neither did I," Theresa said. Clara smiled. "Are you happy, Theresa, truly?" Theresa looked around the small kitchen, at the lamp casting its warm light, at William's wooden animals on the shelf, at the south window that let in the afternoon sun, at the letter she had been writing to her father that was half finished on the desk, and then she looked at her friend. "Yes," she said, "I am truly happy. In the specific and detailed way, not the general one." "That is the only kind worth having," Clara agreed. Frank came in from the barn a few minutes later, brushing dust from his sleeves, and looked at the two women at the table with an expression that contained fondness and a slight wariness, the expression of a man who knows he has walked in on a conversation about important things and is not sure whether to retreat. "We were talking about you," Clara told him cheerfully. "I suspected as much," he said. "Only good things," Theresa said. "That is slightly less believable," he said, and went to pour himself water from the pitcher on the counter. And Clara laughed in the way she had always laughed, bright and unguarded, and Theresa felt the moment settle around her like something she would want to remember. She would remember it. She had a good memory for things that mattered and a habit of writing them down, which meant that the texture of her life, the specific details of it, the letters and the conversations and the evening steps and the afternoon light through the south window, was preserved in a way she was grateful for. She wrote in a journal sometimes, not every day, but when something needed to be put into language in order to be fully known. She wrote about William's first steps, in October 1880, taken across the kitchen floor toward Frank's outstretched hands, the baby's face set in the expression of extreme concentration she was beginning to recognize as the Langston look, inherited directly. She wrote about the day in 1881 when Frank had ridden out in a spring storm to help pull a neighbor's wagon out of a flooded creek, and had come home soaked through, and laughing in a way she had not seen him laugh before, the full, unguarded kind that opened his face entirely. She wrote about the particular quality of mornings on the prairie in early summer, the light coming in flat and gold before the heat arrived, the sound of the birds in the grass outside the window. She was, she understood, keeping a record of happiness. Not because she was afraid it would end. She had learned to trust what she and Frank had built, but because she was a person who loved language and believed that the things that mattered deserved to be written down, which was maybe the most Theresa Wallace thing about her, and which had been true since long before it brought her to a fence post in October 1877, and a newspaper advertisement that changed everything. In the autumn of 1882, a letter arrived from her father that made her sit down at the kitchen table and read it twice before she could fully absorb what it said. Her father had been diagnosed by the doctor in Caldwell with a weakness of the heart. It was not immediately dire, the doctor had said, but it was not something that would reverse, and her father was writing to tell her himself rather than let her find out some other way, because he was William Wallace and he believed in direct communication and had raised her to do the same. He wrote in his measured way that he was arranging his affairs carefully and was not frightened, or at least was trying not to be, and that he wanted to see her and Frank and William before too long, and that he thought she should know he considered his life well spent and his daughter well settled and himself a fortunate man. She read the letter to Frank that evening. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "We should go to Caldwell." "Yes," she said, "soon." Yes, they went the following week. She sat with her father in the house she had grown up in, at the writing desk where she had composed the letter that had started everything. And she held his hand and talked to him about all of it, about Frank and the ranch and William and Clara and the prairie in the morning. And her father listened the way he always had, with the full weight of his attention. He held William on his knee for the better part of an afternoon, the old man and the small boy conducting a serious and fairly incomprehensible conversation that seemed to satisfy both of them enormously. Frank sat with her father in the evenings, and they talked about books and cattle, and the specific gravity of trying to build something lasting in a place that was still being figured out. She heard Frank say, quietly on the second evening, that he was grateful for the kind of daughter her father had raised, and she heard her father say, equally quietly, that he was grateful for the kind of man his daughter had found. She did not intrude on the moment. She stood in the doorway of the sitting room and let it be, the two men talking in the lamplight, and she thought about how everything that had brought this moment into existence, the favor and the borrowed name and the confession and the letters and the June afternoon in the hotel dining room, had been a long and circuitous and sometimes frightening journey toward something very simple and very solid. Her father rallied somewhat over the winter. The heart weakness did not resolve, but it did not progress as quickly as the doctor had feared, and in February 1883, he made the journey south to Caldwell in time to meet his second grandchild, because in December Theresa had realized she was pregnant again. This time it was a girl, born in a warm May, whom they named Margaret after Frank's mother, a woman Theresa had never met but whom Frank described in ways that made her feel like someone she would have loved. Margaret was born with Frank's dark eyes and what appeared to be Theresa's disposition toward observation, watching the world from her very first days with a focused attention that made Moses Dupree say she looked like she was taking inventory, which was exactly right. Her father held both his grandchildren on his second visit south and looked at them with the expression of a man who has seen the thing he most hoped to see, and Theresa sat beside him on the front step in the warm May afternoon and did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. He lived another 2 years. He died in the spring of 1885, quietly, in his own bed in the house on 2nd Street in Caldwell, with the doctor present and with Clara nearby, because Clara had been looking in on him through those last months with the practical generosity that was central to who she was. Theresa and Frank had ridden up when it became clear time was short, and she had been with him at the end. She grieved thoroughly and without pretense. She cried when it needed to be cried and was quiet when quiet was what was needed, and Frank sat with her through all of it with the solid, uncommunicative presence that was the form of comfort she had needed from him more than once, and that he was always able to provide. She wrote about her father in her journal extensively, trying to get him onto the page the way he had actually been, not a sentimentalized version but the real one, the quiet man who had read widely and spoken carefully and given his daughter the freedom to think. She inherited the house on 2nd Street and the dry goods store. She and Frank talked about it carefully over several evenings, considering the various options. In the end, they sold the store. They were not in a position to manage it from 60 miles away, and it made sense to let it go to someone who could, and kept the house, which they used for visits to Caldwell and which felt, she thought, like maintaining a thread of connection to the person who had shaped her. The years moved through their seasons on the ranch in Comanche County, marked by the rhythm of cattle and grass and weather and work, and the specific texture of a life built on honest ground. Frank's ranch grew modestly but steadily. He was not a man who expanded beyond what he could manage well, which she considered a form of integrity. And by the mid-1880s, they employed 4 hands in addition to Moses and Henry Dupree, who had become something more than employees over the years, and more like the kind of fixture that a place takes on when people stay long enough that the land holds their shape. William, by 1886, was 6 years old and had acquired his father's precision and his mother's tendency to argue with things out loud, a combination that was occasionally exhausting and entirely endearing. He had developed a particular attachment to General Frank's old quarter horse, who was by now enormously aged for a working horse, and who had been effectively retired to a position of honored company in the pasture. William visited General every day with the seriousness of a person attending to important obligations. Margaret, at 3, was entirely her own person in a way that made everyone around her slightly surprised and entirely delighted. She had opinions about everything and expressed them in the small but complete sentences of a child who has been talked to honestly from the beginning, and she was frequently to be found in the company of whatever man or woman happened to be working closest to the house, asking questions with the focused persistence of a small and well-intentioned interrogator. Frank, watching his daughter conduct a thorough interview of Henry Dupree one autumn afternoon on the subject of why the sky turned red at sunset, had turned to Theresa with an expression she knew well. "She is going to be trouble," he said. "She is going to be magnificent," Theresa said. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said, which was correct, and she told him so. In 1887, Clara wrote a letter. They still corresponded by letter, the two of them, even though they saw each other several times a year, because there were things they had always said better in writing, in which she mentioned that Edgar had proposed they move the family to Wichita, where he had an opportunity to expand the hardware business. She said she was weighing it carefully and wanted Theresa's honest opinion. Theresa wrote back and said that Clara's honest opinion was the one that mattered, and that her own was only useful as a sounding board, but that since she was asked, if Edgar's opportunity was sound and Clara's heart was willing, then geography was not a good reason to stay in one place, and that their friendship was sufficiently strong to survive 60 additional miles of distance. She wrote, "You found what you were looking for in Caldwell, and it turned out to be a man, not a place. The man is the same man in Wichita." Clara wrote back and said, "This is why you are my dearest friend," and they moved to Wichita in the spring of 1888. The distance did make things different naturally. The Saturday visits became less frequent, replaced by longer annual stays and the steady, faithful correspondence that had always been part of their friendship. But the friendship itself did not diminish. If anything, the letters between Theresa and Clara in those years were richer than they had been when they lived half a mile apart, because distance gave the letters a weight that proximity often diluted. She wrote to Clara about the ranch, about Frank, about the children, about the particular texture of a life she was grateful for in specific and detailed ways. She wrote about what it meant to love someone you had first known through paper and ink, and to find the actual person more fully real than the paper version, not less. She wrote, "I think the letters prepared me for him in a way nothing else could have, because what you learn about someone through their writing is the inside of their mind unmediated, and the inside of Frank's mind is the best place I have ever been." Clara wrote back, I think the letters prepared you for yourself too. I think you wrote yourself into clarity in those months. She kept that letter. She kept it with Frank's letters in the same box under the bed, all of them together, the false beginnings and the honest later ones, and the single crucial envelope addressed to Frank Langston in her own handwriting, the one that had started everything true. The box was full by now. There was, she had occasionally thought, a satisfying weight to it. In 1889, she and Frank celebrated 10 years of marriage with a dinner at the house that was not a formal occasion, but was nonetheless a marked one. Moses and Henry and their families, Clara and Edgar, who made the journey down from Wichita, the children running through the house with the uninhibited energy of children who feel completely safe. Frank raised a glass of water. He was not a drinking man, which she had always appreciated, and said something brief and characteristic. He said, 10 years ago, I put an advertisement in a newspaper because I was hoping to find someone real. I found something considerably more interesting than I expected, which is someone who was real enough to tell me the truth even when it cost her something. I do not know what I did to deserve that, but I am grateful for it every day. She looked at him across the table in their house in Comanche County, with their children and their friends around them, and the prairie outside the windows going dark with evening. And she thought about the fence post, and the circled advertisement, and the letter she had written as a favor, and the love she had fallen into through someone else's words, and out of through her own. And she thought about all the ways the story of how they got here was strange and complicated, and the way the story of where they were now was entirely clear. She raised her own glass. I would do it again, she said, all of it, exactly as it happened. Frank looked at her with that expression she had found a name for years ago, the expression of a man who is exactly where he means to be. So would I, he said. William, who was 9 and had his father's directness, said, what would you do again? What happened? That, Frank said, is a long story. I like long stories, William said. I know, Theresa said. That is how I know you are mine. She told him the story that night, after the guests had gone and the dishes were done and Margaret was asleep, and William was sitting at the kitchen table with the patient attention of a child who has been talked to honestly from the beginning and knows it. She told him the whole of it, the favor and the borrowed name and the letter she had not meant to fall in love with, and the confession and the fear and the June afternoon in the hotel dining room, and the slow and tested and honest thing that had grown from all of it. William listened with the serious concentration that was his father's expression on his mother's face, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. So you lied at first, he said. It was more complicated than lying, she said. But there was deception in it, yes, and I confessed it, and because of that something real could happen. Was he angry? A little, perhaps, but mostly he was honest in return. William thought about this. That is a good story, he said finally. Yes, she said, it is. She tucked him in and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her son in the lamplight. Then she went to the kitchen where Frank was sitting at the table, and she sat across from him, and the lamp between them cast its warm light, and outside the prairie was quiet and enormous under the Kansas stars, and she thought, this is the closed ending, the one you can live inside without needing anything beyond its own borders. Not because nothing difficult would ever happen again. She was not naive enough to believe that, but because the thing they had built together was solid in the way that things built on genuine foundations are solid, the way that things built on honest ground hold. She reached across the table, and he took her hand without looking up from what he was reading, the automatic ease of it, the absolute habit of it, and she thought that this might be the most romantic thing in the world, to be so deeply known by a person that the gesture did not require ceremony or attention to be entirely present. The south window was dark now with night. In the morning the light would come through it as it always did, catching the dust in the air and turning it gold. The children would wake and the ranch would begin its daily noise and purpose. Moses Dupree would have already been out to check the cattle before dawn. Henry would have coffee on somewhere. Frank would go out to the barn and come back with the news of the morning the way he always did, in a few precise sentences that told her everything useful. And she would sit at the writing desk that had come with them from Caldwell, her father's desk, and she would write something, a letter to Clara or an entry in her journal or simply a sentence or two that she needed to put into language in order to know it fully. And Frank would pass behind her at some point and look over her shoulder and say something editorial, and she would accept it or argue with it, and the day would unfold in all its specific and ordinary and irreplaceable detail. This was the life. She had written her way into it, word by word, truth by truth, beginning in borrowed language and arriving at her own. She had fallen in love with every word Frank Langston sent back across the 60 miles of Kansas prairie between them, and she had been brave enough when it mattered to say so in her own name, and it had held. It had held and kept holding and would hold. She looked at her husband across the lamplight and felt, with the specificity she had always trusted more than the general, the particular and the named and the real, the full weight of a happiness she had not planned for and could not have imagined and was grateful for every day of her life. "Frank," she said. He looked up. "I love you," she said. I wanted to say it plainly because I think plain things said when they are true are always worth saying. He held her gaze across the table in the lamplight in their house on the Comanche County prairie in Kansas in the last years of the Old West, and he said, the way he had always said everything important, directly and without performance, without borrowed language, without anything between the word and the feeling it named. "I love you too, Theresa Wallace." She smiled at the use of her full name, the first name on her first letter to him, the name that had started everything true. Outside, the prairie stretched vast and familiar toward every horizon, and the stars above Comanche County were extraordinary in the dark. And inside the house with the south-facing window, there was lamplight and the sound of breathing children and two people who had found their way to each other through words and had built something out of those words that was more real and more durable than most of what surrounded them. She did not need more than this. She did not need it to be anything other than what it was. It was enough more than enough. It was the precise and particular thing she had been searching for in all the years of reading books and asking questions and wanting something real. It was the answer that had arrived in a handwriting she did not know, from a man she had never met, carrying the truth about who both of them were and what they might become together. It had all started with a favor. It had become the most important thing she had ever done. She kept his letters in a box under the bed, every one of them tied with a string from her father's store. She would keep them for the rest of her life, and after her life her children would keep them, and the words would go on carrying what they had always carried. The specific and irrefutable evidence that two people, in the honest wreckage of a stumbled into deception, had found something true and had been brave enough to build on it. That was enough. That was everything.